with the different roots.
Yeah, so oftentimes you can have plants right on top of one another, but they're not really in direct competition with one another because one has horizontal roots that go out way far, and the other one has primarily roots that go downward instead of like. So you can think about the overstory. First and foremost, we'll work from like the biggest stuff down to the smallest stuff. So, and we'll use the example of our land, just so you can see really explicitly. So our overstory is primarily ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. These are like trees that are about 100 feet tall. In a mature food forest situation, this could be something like large nut trees, walnuts, or locusts, or things like that.
Chestnut trees.
Chestnut trees. And then, so that's the overstory. And you can sort of have an understory, which is slightly shorter trees. In our forest, it's primarily oak. These are sort of the next layer of the forest. Below that, you can have smaller trees or large shrubs, moving down in size to smaller trees and bushes. It's beautiful. It's a shrub.
I don't pretend to be an artist.
And then like bushes, which grow, to a certain level. And so you can really look at what are the growth habits and the maximum sort of size of plants, and think about, okay, this plant's going to get 15 feet tall, and I can set it next to a plant that's going to get only about 8 feet tall. And so there's a lot of information out there about how plants grow. And so there's a lot of diversity of heights between the bush and the small tree layer. You get stuff growing in all different sizes.
What do you have for these shrubs and then the smaller shrubs?
What do we have here? We have Ceanothus, which is a bush. Ceanothus californicus, or deerbrush. That's like a nitrogen-fixing native pioneer sort of plant. And then we also have small trees. We have ocean spray, we have Saskatoon serviceberry, we have hawthorn, chokecherry, which is sort of like a tree, grows more in a tree habit.
Oftentimes the perennial grasses get to be like, they're like this. Like those bunch grasses that Andrew was talking about, that tend to sort of occupy that that layer as well.
Particularly in our forest, where we're like right in this transition between forest and high prairie. We're sort of right on the edge. If you go to the 10 miles that way, there's really no forests anymore. It just kind of fades into grassland. So we're in this like in-between period where we don't have enough precipitation to foster really dense understory growth, unless there's water there or there's some sort of specific conditions that are allowing that to happen.
So in a food forest situation, basically what you'd be doing is replacing each of these layers of the forest with a food-producing or yield-producing plant of some sort. So like Andrew mentioned that the tall tree, while here is a ponderosa pine, that it could be a chestnut tree or a walnut tree. These mid-sized trees that here are the oaks could be more akin to your full-size apple tree or pear trees or things along those lines. And then moving into the shrub layer, or not shrub layer, like even smaller than that, it could be a dwarfed fruit tree, an elderberry, things along those lines. Hazelnuts, I think, would fit into that category.
There are some bushes that can get really tall if you allow them to.
Sure, and then moving into the smaller bush layer would be your more of your berries. And then there's the herb layer, which we probably haven't gotten yet to.
Yeah, the herbaceous understory is perhaps one of the most diverse potential layers. Most of the sort of plants that come from, that we grow in gardens are like understory plants. And so you also have potentially ground covers as well, things that are creeping and growing along the surface of the ground.
So some examples of that would be like strawberries are a good ground cover, and actually a natural ground cover in our forest.
You can also have nitrogen-fixing ground covers like clover or bird's foot trefoil.
So much of this is talking about the above ground visible piece of the layers, but then there's also, as was mentioned earlier, the layers that are below ground that you don't see as much. And this is a very important piece that facilitates why these can cohabitate. Because, for example, the pine tree's roots, are more superficial. They extend very far, but they more go along the surface. Whereas the oak trees, more or less go down like this.
They have a big root ball right underneath the plant, but most of their root mass is just going down and seeking water, basically. And oaks are remarkable in that they have a lot more root mass underground than they do top growth above ground, just like as a rule. And then you have like sort of shrubs that may have tap roots, and most of the plants here, besides the pines, have significant tap roots. So that's just like part of their adaptation to finding water. When the first couple feet of soil will dry out usually annually, all the plants need to have deep roots in order to stay green in the summertime.
So a lot of the plants that we have are biennials, and they're in the carrot family, and sort of take off. Carrots are Apiaceae, so carrots, parsnips, and things like that. And so we have a lot of wild forms of plants in that family. The other layer here that's difficult to draw is that of mushrooms and mycelium, which are very important to think about in your ecosystem. Yes, they're yummy to eat, but they're also a great benefit because basically they connect all these different root systems so that the plants can begin to share nutrients.
Right, so in a climax ecosystem, you'll have a really highly developed fungal layer, which forms all sorts of associations with the plants underground. Not only are they the primary detrivores or detritivores, breaking down the material into soil, but they're also like kind of nutrient superhighways and information superhighways within the forest, within a mature forest. And within any food forest system, mushroom will colonize it eventually because you're creating the context within which they want to grow. But you can also help influence that by inoculating your trees with certain things that form beneficial mycorrhiza associations with plants, or you can inoculate the soil with mushrooms that are edible, either native or non-native. So you could have your shiitake logs somewhere in this like shady spot. You could have a bunch of shiitake logs.
Yeah. So just to illustrate that a little bit more, in terms of another thing that the layers create is microclimates. And so you have the sun coming in this illustration that comes along these lines, and so that basically creates everything on this side of the of this pine tree to be shadier and cooler. And things underneath the oak trees in the early spring, for example, because the oaks don't leaf out until May, or your apple trees may not leaf out until late April, that you will have greater capacity to be able to grow things in the understory in the early spring because there's going to be not as much cover. But then in full leaf out, then you'll have shade created.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about specifically dryland forest ecology a little bit later today. We'll talk about the evolutionary strategies in these particular areas and how we can pick plants that have similar evolutionary adaptations.
Do you guys do anything with vining?
Sure. Yeah, the vines are very much another part of the system. We don't have really an example of it in the natural system, but certainly grapes and hardy kiwis. Hops can fit into that category too.
Farming blackberries.
Sure. Yeah.
Indeed. There's also things like, I think it's called mashuao, which is like, it's related to like Jerusalem artichokes and stuff, but they're actually a vine and supposedly very hardy as well. So, we'll move on.
What's the role of vines within that environment? Because you have the...
Well, yeah, the vines can occupy space that nothing else really can. So like this pine tree, while it has leaves over here, it doesn't have any leaves on its trunk itself. So they can actually be capturing sunlight on the bare trunks of trees.
Because so much, again, how do we capture as much sunlight energy as possible, and that that the vines will be, if you have different structural diversity, basically you are covering more surface area.
You have more surface area of leaf to capture the sunlight at
Yeah.
different times.
So, somewhat akin to the vines in our natural ecosystem is that of lichens. We have a fair amount of lichens here, and they are basically occupying the branch substrate, and they are capturing sunlight all through the winter when the deciduous trees don't have leaves.
Yeah, so right now, like, the lichen are soaking up the sunlight and growing before the oaks actually leaf out.
So what's their role in your system then?
The role of,
Of the lichen?
well, there certainly are medicinal lichens that grow. But are you talking about yield specific to us humans, or their
No.
ecological role?
Yeah, their ecological role.
There's just this niche in the forest occupying the leaf or the branch space before the leaves come out, and because lichen are really drought tolerant and they can go dormant, they can exist in this environment, whereas like a plant may not be able to do that, or a vining plant just simply hasn't evolved to fill that niche. There's just lichen to do it, if that makes sense.
Sure, so it's a niche, and then is it also supporting any other life form?
You
besides-
certainly observe, lichen moss fungal associations, both on the substrate of using trees as substrate or rocks, and so I'm sure that there is some sort of connection there, creating little microclimates for shade and things like that for the moss and water retention certainly for the moss.
One thing that I've read recently is that in a lot of climax ecosystems, one of the primary nitrogen fixing elements of the system is lichen. And so basically the lichen, what lichen are mycelium that have like associations with algae, and the mycelium give them sort of nutrients, and the algae photosynthesize, and so there's this hybrid being. Well, the lichen can also capture similar to the legumes, can capture the nitrogen fixing bacteria and have that same sort of, all three of them working together. So they're creating nitrogen for proteins, they're capturing sunlight, and the mycelium are encasing them so that they have water, so they're keeping the water and are more drought tolerant.
Yeah.
So that could very well be happening in our forests, in that they're fixing nitrogen, and then as that stuff dies, or it rains, like the nitrogen is then falling to the surface, it's being washed off. I'm not sure though if that's happening here, but I know that was something I was reading about the Pacific, more of the Pacific coast ecosystems, because there's not nitrogen fixing plants in that ecosystem, really. There's like ferns and really tall trees and berry bushes and stuff. So moving on to another little pattern that's common in nature, we can talk about nurse log. So basically, a nurse log is a tree falls down in the forest, that tree decomposes and provides a substrate for young trees to germinate. It creates both a stockpile of nutrients that the plants will need, as well as a sponge to soak up moisture. So it creates a microclimate, a context for plants to grow. And when we're making a hugelkultur bed, we're more or less doing that exact same thing. We're using that process that happens in nature, and we're just doing it in a controlled way.
So if a tree falls, basically, you have a lot of nutrients in the form of carbon and all the other micronutrients that are contained within trees. And over time, it begins to decompose, and you just get more or less left with this rotting log, which serves as a nurse log, the nursery, a great microclimate for seeds that come in from neighboring trees to get established, and then to begin to grow up into their own little tree. And their roots can sink themselves into this nice carbon-rich, nutrient-rich material, which also is good with water, holds a lot of water. And So that's often what that is what we're doing with hugelkultur, basically taking this idea of a nurse log and modifying it slightly, because in a forest, when a tree will fall, it doesn't necessarily then get covered with soil. And so particularly out here, we don't have as many nurse logs, whereas in the much moister climate on the western side of the mountains, you will have lots of nurse log examples, and part of that is because out here it is so much more arid that this beneficial microclimate isn't created. And so by adding soil on top of it, we contain the system a little bit better, so that all those nutrients remain.
Right.
I've read that birch trees fulfill that function.
So that's a pattern, a common thing in nature that has, more or less been directly translated into a structure that is used in permaculture landscapes, agro-ecological. We can also talk about pit and mound. So this is a very common thing in ecology. It's like a pattern or a structure that forms when a tall tree gets blown over by the wind. Perhaps the roots have rotted because the soil is too moist, or the tree is just in the process of dying and you have a strong wind event. And the tree gets pushed over and the root ball gets ripped out of the ground. And so what's left is the log and its root mass and then the big hole where the roots used to occupy. And so what that essentially does is creates like a pit and a mound, or just generally structural diversity in the forest floor. So where if you had a slope, water would just run down the hill potentially. You've created a pit and a mound that will just capture the water, and it will also capture like leaf matter. It'll be like a mulch trap. And that's more or less exactly what a swale is doing. We're just doing it more in a controlled way and on a larger scale. But you're creating that sort of variation in the landscape to change the hydrological cycle over perhaps a whole hillside, as well as to trap any leaf litter or dirt that may be running downhill. So those are some aspects of, or elements of ecosystems and ecology that more or less have directly translated into things that we do, that people often do in permaculture. And we could just keep going along in these lists, and if you get the packet, you'll see there's about 2 pages of things that have been, of us just talking about what happens in nature and how that's been translated into structural elements in permaculture systems.
And so what part of what this means is that you can come up with your own, and you can name it, permaculture strategy, basically just by observing your own system. That this is, once you start observing it, it's more or less common sense. There's no magic happening here, and everything that you really need to know is happening around you. And so it's just tuning into the dynamics and the processes and the cycles that are in place, and then being creative with how can I use that to grow my apple tree better, or how can I use that to capture and retain water? How can I use that to create self-fertility cycles so that I don't have to keep adding compost or apply fertilizer? So I think with that we'll break again, and we have, so people can get warm, maybe add some more logs to the fire.
Right.
And then we'll go into some more, and let's see, it's 11:15 now.
11:15.
So we're running a little bit behind schedule, but let's break for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll meet back here. Oh, good. Okay. Behind. So we just finished that first section.
Oh.
We took that other break because people were so cold that it made sense to start moving around.